This was one of the videos recorded for one of the meetings at Christi at UTSA. Aside from a few minor edits to clean up the long pauses, it's virtually the exact same video, but in any case, here's the video. Hope y'all enjoy.
Good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Lydia McGrew. Dr. McGrew is an analytic philosopher and author whose work spans philosophy of religion, epistemology, and New Testament studies. She has written extensively on the reliability of the Gospels and the evidential basis for the Christian faith, bringing a rigorous philosophical approach to questions of history and belief. Her books and scholarship have made her a respected voice in both academic and popular discussions. We're honored to have us with us today. Please join us in welcoming Dr. Lydia McGrew.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, Apollos. It's great to be here. I'm going to be speaking on the historical reliability of the Gospels and Acts, and I've called this an evidence sampler. Now, why sampler? And we're going to cover a lot tonight, and some of you may have been an audience last fall, and I covered some things there as well. So why would I still just call it an evidence sampler? Well, because there's still so much more that I could bring. That's important to bear in mind. In fact, there are even categories I'm not going to get a chance to talk about tonight that I talked about a bit last time. So there's always more. There are categories within categories and then multiple examples within those. Most people, when they think about the reliability of the Gospels, they're looking for the wrong kind of evidence. They're looking for what I call blunt evidence. You'll have people that will come to you and they'll say, well, is there some other document that tells about one of Jesus' miracles? Or we want, what are more references about Jesus in non-Christian literature? So what they're looking for is this very direct one-for-one, we want Josephus or Tacitus, whoever it might be, some other ancient author, to talk about some specific evidence in the Gospels. Now, that's not really the best kind of evidence to look for. As far as it goes, it's fine. If you're arguing with a Jesus mythicist who says Jesus didn't exist, then of course, any reference to Jesus as an actual person is relevant. But looking for this kind of blunt evidence makes you overlook what is actually better evidence. Something that's often not understood, especially not by skeptics, but not by some Christians either, is that arguments from silence very often stink. Now, the headline here is a bit of a hyperbole. I actually have a video called Arguments from Silence, the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. So there are good arguments from silence, but in history, particularly when it's used against testimony, when you use the silence of one source as an argument against the affirmation of another source, that is a very dubious use. We have very few books preserved from this time period, sheerly as a matter of chance and time and papyruses falling apart and so forth. We only have maybe a shelf, worth of books from this time if they were printed as books. Also, again and again, we might think that something would be mentioned in a work of secular history, but it isn't. One of my husband's favorite examples on this is that Marco Polo doesn't mention the Great Wall of China when he writes about visiting China. I like to mention that the memoirs of Ulysses S. Grant don't mention the Emancipation Proclamation, and many other examples that could be given. So we need to be really careful about saying, well, surely if Jesus, I've actually had someone say this to me, surely if Jesus fed the 5,000, we would have a book of non-Christian history that would at least mention the story of this person, this rabbi, feeding 5,000 people. But actually, non-Christian Roman authors were not terribly likely to mention an itinerant rabbi who was crucified, whatever miracles were alleged by him, and especially not the specifics of his miracles. They might mention his existence, as indeed Josephus does, But to actually specifically say, it was alleged that he fed 5,000 people, ancient Romans, Josephus was a Jew, of course, but ancient Romans often tended to be rather anti-Semitic. They just didn't think very much of, popular religious figures from this region. So we need to be looking for other kinds of evidence. I want to, before I launch into details of those specific kinds of evidence, I want to make a distinction between internal and external evidence. External evidence comes from outside the canonical books. It includes knowledge of things like geography, archaeology, customs, maybe something we might have from the Talmud about Jewish customs of the times, many things like that. And we'll get some examples here. Internal evidence comes from inside the canonical books, but it's compared with what we know about truthful testimony. I'll have more to say about that later and why that's not question begging, but that's your broad distinction between internal and external evidence. Incidental external confirmations are very difficult to fake and very powerful. Notice I'm using that word incidental. This is where we're looking for something that's actually better than just some sort of blunt reference, because these are little tiny things. So it's not going to be something where you could say, well, someone just saw that this other author mentioned it and then he made up a story to go with it. Instead, they're almost accidental, that they're being confirmed by these external writers. And the gospel authors are clearly not doing what they're doing in the hopes that it will be confirmed in this small, detailed way. Something that's very important to know is that there was no Google. Yes, you might think you know that, but you'd be surprised at how many questions I get from inquirers, correspondents, who just don't seem to really get at a deep level of knowledge how hard it was to gain detailed knowledge at that time, especially of a place that you'd never been or a time period that you've never lived in. I grew up and started becoming a scholar at the time when the internet scarcely even existed at all. And I did my undergraduate work in college when there literally was no internet. But even then, we had reference atlases. We had a thing called the Reader's Guide to Periodical Literature. You can Google and find out what that was. I'm not going to go into a spiel. But the point is, we had a lot of reference materials. Things were deliberately set up to make it easy to look things up, even though you had to do it on paper. There were card catalog systems in the libraries, and every book in the library was indexed in 3 different card catalogs: author, subject, and title. It was all made very deliberately easy. There was nothing like that at the time. When you hear somebody mention a library, well, there was a library in Alexandria, not the kind of library you're thinking of. We're talking about a large number of scrolls. Scrolls, by the way, don't have any page numbers, so there can't be an index. It would just be difficult to exaggerate how hard it would be to write an accurate historical work of fiction at that time that was fiction but was accurate in all these many different details. With that, I'm going to go to the first of my concrete examples of external confirmations of the Gospels and Acts. This is named statistics. Now, I could say a lot more about this, but I'm going to try to go through it kind of quickly. What we have are statistical data that were made by some Jewish scholars that are not Christians, of Jews in different regions of the world throughout Jewish history. And so at the time of Christ, in various areas, they'll get these things from ossuaries, which were bone boxes and would have names engraved on the side, from inscriptions, from works of literature, written works and so forth, all sort of different places. And then they made statistical databases. one of the things that they found is that there is a certain amount of regional variation. So, for example, the name Sabbateus was the second place most popular male name in Egypt at the time, the approximate time of Christ in that century, but it was the 68th place in Palestine. So that's obviously a big difference. Well, did you notice anybody named Sabbateus in the Gospels and Acts? Nope, neither did I. You put together a database of male names, and I say male here because otherwise we should have way too small of a data set. Okay, I'm going to get to Mary and female names in a moment, but first of all, you put together a database of all of the male names of people living there in that region where Jesus moved and in the region where the church was founded, of all those male names, and then you compare that to the male names in that region as we know of them independently from this other database that I've just been talking about, that's made up of a much wider set. And what you find is a pretty good statistical mapping. Now, because it's still a relatively small set, I believe it's about 83 unique male names as persons, there. You're going to get some differences. So, for example, there's only one Lazarus or Eleazar, even though that was a pretty common name. So in a sample size of that small size, you would expect some outliers, but it's still pretty darn good for the size it is. But what I want to move on to that's almost more exciting and is related is disambiguation. At that time, you would find the use of something like the son of so-and-so. Okay, so Jesus sometimes refers to Peter, Simon, son of John, he'll say, or Simon, son of Jonah. We find both. Or Simon the leper. I just saw a Babylon Bee story yesterday about Simon the leper exchanging sympathy with the Ethiopian eunuch about which one has the worst name in the New Testament. So obviously he wasn't a leper anymore at that time, but probably had been. So he became known as Simon the leper. The reason for this is the same type of reason you might have if you had 3 different people named Bill in your group. You'd use the last name more often so that they would know which Bill you were talking about. And so these were used in that same way to distinguish. That's why you have different people named Simon in the Gospels and Acts, but you can always tell which one it is. And what we find is that these disambiguators are mapped really well with the popular names in the Gospels. So even Lazarus, okay, even though he's the only one, and so in that sense, it's not a representative sample where we're finding a lot of Lazaruses in the Gospels. When he's introduced in John, it says Lazarus of Bethany, which is probably how he was known because it was a popular name. So the disambiguation tracks popularity in the Gospels. And this we can see even with the women. So even though we have such a small sample size, we can see these clumps of names like Mary. You have so many named Mary, and then they'll be distinguished, right? Mary of Clopas, Mary, the mother of James, Mary of Magdala, that would be Mary Magdalene, and so forth, right? That are made clear as to which Mary it is. If they were just inventing these names, why invent so many named Mary and then have to disambiguate them? Why do that? Whereas if they really are the names of the women involved, of course, that would make sense because that was a very popular name, female name, as was Simon. By the way, we find that even modern novelists who have much more opportunity to research get this wrong. There's a novel called The Spear by a Catholic author named Louis de Wool. He clearly had Josephus available to him, and Josephus is pretty accurate with his name statistics as well. Not that he's trying, he's just telling the stories, and it turns out that way. And de Wool had clearly read Josephus And yet, DeWalt doesn't pick up on who needs to be disambiguated and who doesn't. DeWalt's just like, oh, looks like they like to say so-and-so bar so-and-so. So I'll just, and he just disambiguates everybody. He has no idea that that's something you do with the more popular rather than the less popular names. Okay, I got to keep moving here, but real quickly, something noticed by the scholar Peter J. Williams is that in the Gospels, when the characters in the stories are speaking, they refer to Jesus with disambiguators. They'll say Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus the son of the carpenter, Jesus the son of Joseph, and so forth. Jesus who is called the Christ. So when they speak of him, they use disambiguators. Obviously, when the narrator speaks of him, he's just talking about one Jesus, so he doesn't bother because his audience knows whom he's speaking of. Well, Yeshua, Jesus' name, was very popular. And so this use of disambiguators by the characters is a mark of authenticity because that's how they really would have spoken of him. They would have said which Jesus they were talking about because, there wasn't an entire many thousands of people, movement that's been going on for 2,000 years based on this man. And so if they said Jesus, they'd be like, Jesus who? And the characters speak authentically in that respect. All right. Here's another little external confirmation of the nativity story in Matthew, and that one comes in for a lot of doubt, comes in for a lot of skepticism and questioning, especially the flight to Egypt because it isn't mentioned in Luke. Well, Matthew talks about coming back from Egypt. They come back, and he says that Joseph, when he heard that Archelaus was ruling, Herod the Great was dead, but he says Archelaus was ruling. Joseph didn't want to settle where Archelaus was ruling. And so he went into Nazareth. He went back to Nazareth instead of settling again in Bethlehem. Well, why would that be? We know that by settling in Galilee, he was under a different son of Herod the Great, who was Herod Antipas. So it wasn't like he was trying to get out of being ruled over by a son of Herod the Great. So why Archelaus in particular? Well, we have other knowledge from Josephus about Archelaus and how he kind of started off with a bang after his father died. He actually got involved in a controversy with the Jewish people who they killed some Roman soldiers, and he sent troops into the temple, and he killed a bunch of Jews, and then he canceled Passover and so forth. So, and actually there were complaints made about him to Caesar, and he had to go defend himself that he had been too harsh or whatever. So you could imagine if, since Joseph's coming back right after the death of Herod the Great, these events with Archelaus would have happened right around the time that he's coming back, and he could have heard some of these stories and said, well, I don't want to be near where that guy's ruling. I already ran away from one murderous king. We don't need to settle under a murderous tetrarch. So that explains it. But of course, Matthew doesn't say anything about that. We know about that externally. Here's another piece of external evidence. The Pool of Bethesda. I've done a deep dive on this recently. Story told only in the Gospel of John, which causes it to be questioned right away. If some story is only told in John, it gets extra questioning. Critical scholars suggested that when John says there were 5 porches around the pool, that was just invented because, after all, they didn't make pentagonal structures back then. So what's that all about? Ah, said a French critic named Loisy, I bet it was to symbolize the 5 books of Moses and that Jesus is greater than Moses. And so, the idea was definitely that John made that up. All right. But there were archaeological excavations going on, and some of these were going on right around the time that Loisy wrote. But there were even more then, and they continued throughout the early part of the 20th century, culminating in some important ones in the 1950s, showing that there were what the pool of Bethesda was. It was two roughly rectangular pools right next to one another with a walkable dam across. So that would be, if you think of each of the long sides as a side, and then the dam, that's 5. Okay. And they actually found fragments of columns and capitals and so forth on some of those sides, not on every single one of the sides. A Byzantine church had been built across the dam, so that would have been completely cleared. And there's been all kind of controversy about dating these fragments of the capitals and the columns, but there was definitely evidence that there had been colonnades there at some point. So this just takes care of all of that. No, John wasn't implying that it was a pentagon, and no, there's no reason to think that he invented it for some heavy, deep, invisible, symbolic reason, but just that there actually were these 5 porticos, plausibly built as part of the building projects of Herod the Great, although we don't know that for sure. That's a conjecture, but it easily could have been. All right, now I'm going to move to the book of Acts here, and I could spend all night just talking about the book of Acts. It's an amazing book. It has external evidence everywhere. This phrase is from my husband, Tim McGrew. Acts gets hard things right. If you don't take anything else away from my talk tonight, get that phrase in your mind. Acts gets hard things right. Again, remember what I said before about the difficulty looking things up, the difficulty researching if you weren't right there, to know that these things were right. It's all over the place in the book of Acts. And as I like to say, Acts is like a blockade down across the road that goes to a thesis of legend or fiction or novel writing or whatever. You just can't get past the book of Acts, which was written by the same person who wrote the book of Luke, by the way. So that's very significant. I'm going to give you just a few of these external examples. I don't know if you remember the story in Acts 22. The Apostle Paul has just been rescued by some Roman soldiers from a mob that was going to kill him. They were going to, they were definitely going to beat him up because they believed he had desecrated the temple. And the Romans see this semi-riot getting started, and they didn't like riots, so they come running down. They rescue him. They're about to beat him. And it's amazing how often that happens. Like here, you rescue the guy, but then you say, you must have done something to make those people mad. Let's find out what you did. You're a troublemaker. You're causing them to get mad at you and try to beat you up. So they rescue him from being beaten to death, but they're about to beat him too. And he says, is it lawful to beat a Roman citizen unless he has been condemned? Ooh, the answer to that is a big no. You could get in big trouble for doing that. And so the message is taken to the commander, be careful, this man is a Roman citizen. So the commander goes and talks to Paul, and he says to Paul, I bought this citizenship with a great price. I paid a lot of money for my citizenship. And Paul says quietly, but I was born free. So, well, what's that all about? Why is he bringing this up? Well, Colin Hemer, the great, late, great scholar of Acts, talks about the reign of Claudius, who was emperor at that time. And we have records that you could actually buy Roman citizenship. There was that much corruption that you could just pay and become a Roman citizen. And yet we also have records in Diocletius that the cost of that corruption actually went down during the reign of Claudius. It got cheaper and cheaper. So as Colin Hemer says, this man had presumably gained his rights early in the reign of Claudius and had seen his pride reduced by Claudius' later practice, and his remark reflects this. In other words, he's like, oh, are you, he's saying to Paul, are you one of those guys who came along and bought citizenship for some small amount of money, because I paid a lot for it. And then Paul's like, no, actually, I was born free, which is, in a way even better, or would have been regarded as even better. So it's a wonderful, wonderful little incidental confirmation. I hope by this time you're starting to get a sense of what I meant when I said we need to look for a better kind of evidence. This kind of thing right here is so indirect that it's even stronger as a confirmation of this story than it would be to find someone mentioning that story. Because sure as shooting, I can tell you one thing. If you found this exact story in some other ancient source, there'd be some skeptic out there saying, oh, maybe the book of Acts was written after that source and just got the story from that source. But this little kind of confirmation, it can't be faked in that way. All right. Here's another one. In Acts 14, when they're in Lycaonia, it talks about the people crying out that the gods have come down. This is Paul and his companion. And we actually do know that there was a separate language for that one particular province. See, not every province of the Roman Empire had its own little local language, but there's a confirmation of this in an obscure textual artifact. Here's one that I mentioned last time. I asked Apollos how many people would be here who were here last time. Some of you may be. This was a little island that gets mentioned in the story of the voyage and shipwreck of Paul. And it talks about them passing Cauda and getting blown there by a storm, okay? We know where Cauda is. I mean, Cauda's still there. Obviously it's an island. It didn't disappear in the intervening 2,000 years. But remember what I said about how hard it is to fake these things and how hard it would be to look them up? Two other ancient sources, Pliny the Elder, and that's in the 1st century in the natural history, and Ptolemy, a 2nd century geographer, place Cauda in the wrong location, which is also a location that wouldn't fit with what Acts is describing, because Acts describes the direction the wind was coming from and so forth, and then they come upon Cauda after they've left a certain town behind them, and it all fits together with where Cauda really is. But if Luke were written after Pliny the Elder and had tried to look it up, as you're told, maybe you could just look it up. Well, if Luke had tried to look it up, he would have gotten it wrong, because these sources actually had it wrong. And I did a deep dive in that one recently and figured out, just exactly how they have it wrong. And especially for Pliny, I was able to really get that clear in my mind. And sure enough, Pliny's got it wrong. So it's just amazing. Again, Acts gets hard things right. All right, one more. In Acts 17, there was a riot in Thessalonica. And, Paul, man, that guy seems to have caused riots everywhere he went. And the rioters grab a believer named Jason and some other Christians, and they drag them before the politarchs, the people in charge. Okay? Now, that term, the politarchs, that doesn't just mean, some vague thing, like a judge, like we might use the word judge, or, policeman or whatever. It wasn't some term that could just be used anywhere in the Roman Empire that you could have just picked up. It was a technical term for a board of magistrates in Macedonia, which is where Thessalonica was and still is. It is attested in inscriptions, more inscriptions from Thessalonica than from any other single city. The inscriptions that use that term tend to clump in Macedonia. We have a few from other places, but particularly when you look at the 1st century when these events are taking place, they really clump in Macedonia, and within Macedonia, they really clump in Thessalonica. This is exactly the sort of thing that a fictionalizer might get wrong or might leave out or might use just some broader phrase, but The author of Acts uses the specific phrase which is right for that location, which he could have known if he was actually a companion of Paul. There are many, many more of these. If you want more Acts material, you can probably Google. Years ago, Tim did a Apologetics Academy webinar called The Reliability of Acts. You can Google that up, but I also strongly encourage you to read The Book of Acts in the Setting of Hellenistic History by Cullen Heemer. You can check that book out and read it on archive.org for free, and it's, you know, you're not breaking any laws or anything. It's just on there to be read. And I own a copy. It's worth buying, but it is a little pricey. So, but I strongly advise you to read it for more. All right, I want to talk now about internal evidences. What are internal evidences? They're marks of truthfulness within the documents themselves. Now, my goodness, there's an infamous skeptic who loves, whenever you try to do something like this, to play a little jingle, "The Bible tells me so," as if you're just some kind of fundamentalist if you use any kind of internal evidence. So we need to understand, why is it not question begging to use these? Well, for one thing, to use them, you don't have to assume that these are God's word, that they must be true, that they're inerrant. That's not what you're doing. What you're doing is looking at them and seeing how the things we find in the Gospels compare with what we know from common sense and observation in truthful testimony otherwise. And they can be applied to secular testimonies as well. In the last few days and weeks, I've been doing a deep dive into 911 first responder testimonies. These are just absolutely fascinating. It's almost addictive to read them, because you can fit all these little things together and say, oh, I wonder what happened to that guy, and did he survive, and why didn't this bit get mentioned over here? It's just fascinating stuff. There's hundreds of them on the New York Times archive. And you find these kinds of things there. And so, in other words, we can observe things over here in witness testimony outside of the Gospels, and then we can observe them inside of the Gospels. And so they're internal, but they're evidences. They're not some kind of circular argument. Several of you have no doubt heard of undesigned coincidences. By this time, it's become somewhat popular. My husband, Tim, was one of those who revived the argument from undesigned coincidences going on about 10 years ago now, actually, when he introduced me to the argument. These are incidental interlockings that point to the truth. They show that the authors were close to the facts, that they were truthful about little details, and yet they indicate independence. They're not just copying each other. Let's look at some specifics. Here's one. In Matthew, it's telling a story, which is also, by the way, found in the other synoptic gospels, about the death of John the Baptist. And it leads into it, just as it does in Mark, by talking about Herod musing about Jesus. And Herod and other people thinking that maybe Jesus was John the Baptist risen from the dead. But there is a little phrase that's only found in the book of Matthew. It says that Herod said to his servants, "This is John the Baptist risen from the dead. This must be John the Baptist risen from the dead." That "to his servants" is only in Matthew. I want to point something out, that this is a story that's a lot like the story as it's told in Mark. And so from a critical scholarly perspective, it would be assumed that Matthew's copying this story from Mark. But this is a unique bit that's not in Mark. All right. Well, if you're writing a historical novel or a story set with a historical person, you might make something like that up, right? You want to make it a little more vivid, not just that Herod said, but he specifically said it to his servants and so forth. Maybe you might think that's what Matthew did. Well, because you might say, well, how could Matthew possibly know that Herod is saying this specifically to his servants? And for that matter, how did the Christians, how would they have actually known what Herod said to his servants? All right, so you go over to Luke 8:3. Now, contrary to what you might think, this is not Luke's version of the death of John the Baptist. That's in a different chapter. This is not the parallel passage to Mark 14. This passage in Luke is talking about some women who contributed to the ministry of Jesus. And it mentions Mary Magdalene, for example, and several others, Susanna. And it mentions a woman named Joanna, and it says that she was the wife of Chuza, Herod's household manager. Now, Luke is clearly not trying to explain anything in Matthew. Okay, he's not thinking about a story in Matthew at all at this point. He's just talking about these women who followed Jesus around and contributed to his ministry. But now we have a link between Herod's household, the management of his household, his servants and so forth, and the Christian movement, the Christians. And that is Chuza and his wife Joanna. Now we have an explanation for how they could have known what he was saying specifically to his servants. I love that one. It's so indirect. Here's one I call, How Did Bartimaeus Know? In Mark and Matthew, we're told a story of how Jesus is passing through Jericho. And Mark specifically mentions that one of this blind man, he only mentions one, Matthew mentions two. But Mark mentions his name, Bartimaeus, and they both say when this blind man or these blind men heard that Jesus of Nazareth was passing by, they began calling out, Jesus, have mercy on us. Jesus, son of David, have mercy on us. It also says that there were huge crowds. You may remember the Zacchaeus story that he couldn't see, had to climb up a tree to see. Now, a question that might not occur to you if you're thinking of all the Gospels together, but that should occur to you if you think just about the synoptics, is how did Bartimaeus know that Jesus could heal the blind? Because specifically in the synoptics, it's hard to believe it, but prior to this time in Jericho, no other healings in the synoptics have been recorded this far south. It's amazing to think about that the synoptics being Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It's really focused on Jesus' ministry in Galilee prior to this time. Now, okay, people were traveling back and forth from Galilee. Maybe Bartimaeus and his companion heard about Jesus healing blind people and doing other great miraculous healings up in Galilee through some traveler. I'm not going to say that's impossible, but it is rather curious that they immediately knew who it was. Like they heard that Jesus of Nazareth was passing by and they were immediately thinking, wow, maybe this guy can heal us. And they start yelling and crying out to him, asking for his help. Well, a much better explanation than just maybe some traveler is found in the Gospel of John. Because in John, we find out that Jesus had done healings much closer to Jericho than Galilee. In John 9, he even heals the man born blind. And in John 11, of course, he raises Lazarus. In fact, at the time of the raising of Lazarus, it even indicates that the crowds commented, why didn't Jesus come and heal his friend Lazarus sooner? Because he had opened the eyes of the blind. So that healing of the man born blind, it made a big stir. And that the news of it would have been known in Jericho is quite probable, quite plausible, and I think is a good explanation for how Bartimaeus and his companion immediately knew the name of Jesus of Nazareth and immediately thought, oh my goodness, maybe he can heal us. Okay. There are incredibly intricate, undesigned coincidences between the book of Acts and Paul's letters. These, along with other evidence, provide, such as I gave before, right? I gave the details in Acts that indicate that the author was a companion of Paul, but the undesigned coincidences as well provide extremely strong evidence that the author was a companion of Paul. And this is despite the fact that there are alleged contradictions between the book of Acts and Paul's letters. Bart Ehrman likes to talk about those. But if anything, those at least show that the book of Acts was not based upon Paul's letters. I don't think the author of the book of Acts read Paul's letters. They were sent to the churches. But yet, there are these amazing connections. In fact, I can place several letters of Paul within the historical events in Acts quite precisely by these incidental references and connections. 1 Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians, 1 and 2 Corinthians, and Romans, to be specific. But astonishingly, Acts never mentions even once that Paul wrote a letter. You know, he's not there saying, you know, and when I went in to tell Paul it was time to leave and get on the boat, I found him writing a letter. There's no mention of that. And yet, they fit so well with the letters that again and again you can place the letters within them. These are worthy of a whole presentation in and of themselves, and some of the undesigned coincidences between Acts and Paul's letters are hard to do briefly. I suggest that you see for a clump of them, a cluster of them, and there are more still, but for a certain cluster of them, I did a video on YouTube called Just How Wrong Can Bart Ehrman Be About Acts and Paul's Letters? And you can Google that on my YouTube channel and find that. But I'm going to give you just one part of that cluster here tonight. If Timothy comes. All right. When you go to the book of 1 Corinthians, you find that it was written at a time when Paul had sent Timothy to go to Corinth in Greece. Okay. He says it explicitly. 1 Corinthians 4:17, I sent unto you Timothy, who is my beloved son. Then in 1 Corinthians 16, he says, if Timothy comes, see that he may be with you without fear. Let no man therefore despise him. I think Paul felt that Timothy was kind of gentle, and also Timothy was kind of young. And so he was always kind of concerned, you know, that people might look down on him or that Timothy might be pushed around, and he wants to be sure they don't do that. So he sent Timothy to them. What we can infer from this is that the letter is going to get there before Timothy does, even though Timothy has already left. Think about it. You can see that here. He says, I sent unto you Timothy, past tense. So he's already left. But then he says, if he comes, see that he may be with you without fear. Let no man despise him. So he's expecting the letter to get there sooner, with this warning, hey, you guys, respect Timothy. When he shows up, or if he shows up, you better respect him. Okay. Well, how is that? If Timothy has already left before Paul has sent the letter, how is Timothy not going to get there until after the letter gets there? That's a little odd, isn't it? Why would Paul think the letter is going to travel there faster than Timothy and even be able to overtake him, even though Timothy's already gone? Well, Paul is in Ephesus at the time, and he makes that really explicit. I give more details about this in the video, but he says he's going to remain in Ephesus. Pretty much says that he's in Ephesus when he's writing 1 Corinthians. He probably sent the letter across the Aegean Sea by boat, and Timothy probably went the longer way. There are multiple ways to get from Ephesus to Corinth. And there was a longer way, an overseas way. In fact, in Acts 19:21-22, it says specifically that Paul sent Timothy and Erastus ahead of him into Macedonia. I'll show you a map in a minute here. But Acts doesn't specifically mention that Timothy and Erastus were being sent to Corinth, only that they were being sent into Macedonia. It says that Paul himself intends eventually to go into Macedonia and Achaia. Achaia is another name for Greece. But it gives no impression that he's specifically trying to send Timothy to minister to the Corinthians. The epistle does. right? It says, I sent you Timothy, because there were problems in the Corinthian church, and he sent Timothy on. But Acts doesn't seem to be based on that. If Acts were based on 1 Corinthians, you would expect the author of Acts to mention Timothy being sent not just into Macedonia, but to Corinth specifically to, help with the problems there. But there's no any indication of that. And the epistle doesn't mention Erastus either. So the mention of Erastus doesn't appear to be based on the epistle. That's only found in Acts. So these definitely appear independent, and yet they fit together beautifully. Because, here we go, here's a map. Here's Ephesus, where Paul is writing the letter to the Corinthians. He wants to stay in Ephesus for a while. He doesn't want to leave quite yet, but he wants to send both a letter and Timothy to the Corinthians because he knows there are problems there. He also wants Timothy apparently to minister to some people in Macedonia also. So he sends Timothy into Macedonia. And so here's your overland route up through Troas, across, over. Here's Macedonia, right? And here's Greece. Macedonia sits on top of Greece. So he sends Timothy up here into Macedonia. And later he does meet Timothy in Corinth. That's made clear in Acts as well, but it doesn't mention that he sent him there in Acts 19. But we can now put it all together that the idea was he was supposed to go through Macedonia and eventually make his way down to Corinth. Meanwhile, while Paul is staying there in Ephesus, continuing to minister in Ephesus, he writes a letter to the Corinthians, and he sends that letter over across the Aegean Sea. So it's a much shorter route that way. Now, people have pointed out to me that it might have been sent by a coasting vessel. We don't know that it went across the absolute straightest route or whatever, but it would definitely take less time for a ship to get across from Ephesus to Corinth than for Timothy to take this long overland route. So he puts that letter on a boat. Paul always wanted his letters, to get there. He would be using, he'd be using texting now. If he lived now, he'd be using email. He'd be using social media, whatever. Paul wanted to get his communications out. And so he can be reasonably sure that his letter is going to get there before Timothy gets there. And it's this beautiful explanation, but you only get it when you put the two of them together so that it answers that question, how is the letter going to get there before Timothy does? All right. These undesigned coincidences in one direction confirm Pauline authorship, but in the other direction, they confirm the historicity of the Acts narratives. As I mentioned before, there are what sometimes look like discrepancies between them. Mentions, let's say, of only a Jewish audience in Acts, but only a Gentile audience in that same city in the epistles. Well, of course, Paul could have talked to both Jews and Gentiles in a given city. In fact, he often did. But Bart Ehrman makes much of these to make discrepancies out of them. But if nothing else, they show independence. And yet they fit together in these beautiful ways. If you want to see more, my oldest book in New Testament studies, Hidden in Plain View, Undesigned Coincidences in the Gospels and Acts. Okay, very quickly, I want to just give you another category here. Unexplained allusions. An unexplained allusion is something that doesn't look like literature. It doesn't look like polished fiction. It's unpolished. Best understood by examples. In John 2:12, it says, Jesus and his mother and his disciples went down to Capernaum and stayed there a few days. Full stop. It doesn't say why they went there and stayed a few days. This is also an incidental confirmation because Capernaum is down from Cana, which is where they've just been. You do go downhill. But why? I mean, if you're writing your story, this doesn't contribute anything to the story. It interrupts the story. It has no literary function whatsoever. But it's the way that people talk when they're telling stories, and they just throw things in there that don't fit with anything else. There's no reason why they should mention that, okay? That particular thing. Another example, in Acts 18:18, it says, Paul had his hair cut at Cenchrea, for he was keeping a vow. Luke is writing this for a man named Theophilus, who may not have been a Jew at all. Some people think he was a Jew, but he may not have been a Jew at all. And even what we know about a Nazirite vow, it has to do with growing your hair, not with cutting your hair. The author of Acts doesn't pause to explain what's the connection between cutting your hair and having a vow. He's just with him at that point, and he mentions this weird thing. He's at this town named Cenchrea, and he's had a vow, and somehow that involved cutting his hair, moving on, and then you just move on, and it doesn't look literary. The Gospels and Acts are actually in many ways very unliterary. All right. There are other categories of evidence that I haven't had time to discuss here. I mentioned a couple of these in my previous talk. Unified personalities, Peter, Jesus, Mary and Martha, Thomas. Unnecessary details. And by the way, fictional authors can also make up details. It's not a good response to these kinds of internal evidences, because when fiction authors make up details, they don't look like this. And we can talk about that more if you want to in the Q&A. Some of my other books, I have a whole book just on John, because John gets so much extra doubt. That one is called The Eye of the Beholder, the Gospel of John as Historical Reportage. I have a whole book. These, by the way, are not in order. The Mirror of the Mask actually was written before The Eye of the Beholder. But I have a whole book on what's wrong with fact-changing theories and the idea that the Gospels are using fact-changing compositional devices. That book is called The Mirror of the Mask. And then I have this book, Testimonies to the Truth, Why You Can Trust the Gospels. Very layman-oriented, very lay-friendly. And it is now available in all three forms, Kindle, paper, and also an audiobook. Just recently came out, read by my daughter, Bethel, and it's the only one that is available in audiobook. So if you want an audiobook, go get it, because she does a good job reading it. And she and other people very generously edited the files, got them into the form that Audible wanted them and everything. And that's very new. That just came out there. There is no leap of faith required to believe that the Gospels and Acts are reliable. That's confirmed by objective evidence. So we don't have to cling to a faith against reason. Christianity is a faith confirmed by reason. If you want to contact me, you can do that by going to lydiamcgrew.com, and you can see links to my curriculum vitae if you want to see what I published, my YouTube channel, my podcast archives, my blog. You can email me, lydiamcgrew@gmail.com. Please be sure to introduce yourself if you email me. Just tell me a little bit about yourself and try to have a focused question. You can follow my public content, Lydia McGrew Author, on Facebook. Starting this next Sunday, I'm going to start a new YouTube series on my YouTube channel, and I'll be announcing that on Facebook. I made a little sort of teaser about that. I think I posted that today. Fan Christopoulos, whom some of you may have heard of, and I sat down for a total of 6 hours. No, we did not do that all on one day. We did multiple sessions with plenty of breaks. And we took apart a long video by the YouTube skeptic Apologia and a statistician named Brian Blaze, where they claim to be telling you, what does Bayes' theorem really say about the resurrection? Well, now you're on my turf. I mean, Bayes' theorem is my thing. as a probability theorist who's applied that to the resurrection. And so Than and I just went blow by blow by blow through that and took it apart. And very generously, Eric Manning helped to break that up into 9 sessions. So I'm going to get 9 weeks of content out of this, topic by topic, on my YouTube channel. So starting on March 1st. But you can get links to all of these things. I want to point out my podcast archives are in 2 different links. You can find both of those at lydiamcgrew.com prior to November of 2024 and since November 2024. So if you want to hear the audio content, that's just the audio content from the YouTube. If you want to hear that in podcast form, don't miss the fact that there are 2 different links. We ran into a technical problem and had to start over again in November of 2024. Okay, at this point, I'm going to stop sharing and we're going to go to question and answer.
Yep, let's give it a round of applause.
Thanks, guys.
All right, let's go through these questions real quick.
Hey, thank you so much for your presentation. I have a couple questions. To start with, this is a lot of really good information, especially about specifics. Is there a popular level formula in maybe like a concise way that you found is effective just for regular people to kind of get them interested in checking out the historicity and internal and external evidences? Is there like a little concise formula you have for the popular level that works, or?
I guess the way I would put it is the Gospels and Acts are super reliable and we've got buckets of evidence. You know, I mean, like, you just be enthused. But I guess not so much a formula, but I would say if you want an overview specifically for the Gospels, it doesn't do Acts, I have to say. But for the Gospels, Testimonies to the Truth is the book to go to. It's not big. It's not super long. It has study questions. It has discussion questions. It's meant for groups as well as individuals to use. That's why it has discussion questions and suggested answers in it. So I do find that one's really user friendly. So that's probably the best I can do for you. What I am trying to do with these specifics is also to give you sort of a sense of hierarchical structure, right? So you've got evidence, and you've got internal and external, and then you've got, under internal, you've got undesigned coincidences, unexplained allusions, unified personalities, and over here in external, you have archaeology, name statistics, customs, or knowledge of customs, and so forth. And then under each of those, you have the specific examples under each of those. So you can think of it as sort of a pyramid structure. So that might help you to sort of picture it. And I do find that the chapter headings in Testimonies to the Truth are, they go down through these various categories. So that can help for an outline. And even though they don't mention Acts, even though Testimonies isn't about Acts, the categories apply to Acts as well.
Thank you. That's super helpful. Second question would be, you were saying a lot. You said a lot of the author of the Book of Acts. You kept saying the author of the Book of Acts. I was and then I heard you mention Luke as the author later. Do you affirm a traditional Lucan authorship of Acts?
Yeah, definitely. I
Okay.
do. Part of the reason I repeat that so much is because let's suppose it turned out to be Epaphroditus. I'm totally making that up. Nobody thinks it was Epaphroditus. I'm just making that up as an example. The crucial thing is that he was a close companion of Paul, okay, and had an opportunity to know and speak with the apostles, okay. So now, of course, we've got all this external evidence, that it was Luke, okay, but I guess that's what I like to draw attention to by continuing to say the author of Acts, is to say this guy, whatever name you put, whatever name was his actual name, who was this really close companion of Paul and was so careful about what he wrote, and he had all these properties to him. That's the most important thing.
Perfect. That's helpful. Does anybody else have any questions?
First of all, thank you so much for the presentation. I loved it so much. My question would be, for people who want to get even more into this subject, do you have, other than the books that you recommended, 2 beginner level books to get into defending the reliability of the gospel, and 1 more intermediary book that you think are a must read?
Well, I mean, recommending one's own books it sort of looks a little tacky, but I guess if you want to call it 2 beginner levels, I would go with Hidden in Plain View and Testimonies to the Truth. Those are my, very definitely targeted toward a lay audience. Intermediate is difficult to say. Like, I guess I wouldn't call The Mirror of the Mask intermediate, because there's so much boring stuff I had to discuss in that book, because there are so many bad theories and the only way to refute them is to get into boring stuff. Okay, it's the best way I can put it. I think I might consider The Eye of the Beholder to be more intermediate level. It is rather thick, but I think it's a pretty smooth read. And in fact, I think an interested layman can read any of those books, but I would say definitely get started with Hidden in Plain View and Testimonies to the Truth, and then you can kind of go from there.
Yeah, and for what it's worth, for those of you wondering, The Eye of the Beholder is the book on John, which is what Dr. Lydia McGrew is referring to for the intermediary book.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have anything else, Jason? Did you have one more?
Yeah. Slightly off topic. I wanted to ask a little bit about genre and how kind of dyschronology and discontinuity fits in to gospel reliability, because we, to me, it can sometimes feel like a cop out to say, yeah, there's real dyschronologies, from in the, John and Matthew, for example, but it's just because they're approaching it from 2 different theological perspectives. Sometimes that feels like a cop-out answer. Can you say a little bit about the genre of gospel and how it's okay that we have some dyschronologies in there? Or?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and I have a lot to say about that actually. So, first of all, I use the word dyschronology myself in a really specific way that I'm not sure if it means the same thing as the way you're using it. So, let me define a term right now here so that we're, on the same page and understanding each other. I have a YouTube video you can look up. It's called 4 Ways of Talking About Time or something like that. But specifically, I distinguish cases where an author is not intending to indicate the order in which things happened, and he just says, I did, or this happened and this happened, maybe uses the word and places where an author is intending to do so. And sometimes when a person says and, he might say things in an order different from when they actually occurred. I've really run into this in the 911 testimonies, by the way. Like I say, that stuff's addictive. Go read that stuff. It's so fascinating. Where, the person will say, and this happened, and then the interviewer is like, wait, are you going back? When did that happen? And the interviewer has to ask them to clarify. So, I might say, yesterday I went to the bank and I went to the grocery store, but I don't necessarily mean I went to the bank before I went to the grocery store. And that's what I call achronological narration, when you're not trying to indicate a chronology at all. Okay, you didn't mean, maybe someone thinks you did, but if so, they've misunderstood. You didn't mean to indicate what order things happened in. But dyschronology, as I define it, and I spell it with a Y, meaning something bad's going on. Dyschronological narration occurs when the person is deliberately changing it. So, for example, if I said, yesterday I went to the bank and then afterwards I went to the store. And I know perfectly well that I went to the store, before I went to the bank, but for some reason, who knows what reason, I changed it. That would be dyschronological narration. Now, we have places in the Gospels where we do have trouble telling how their chronologies line up. Matthew and Mark definitely don't narrate things in the same order, that's for sure. But so then we have to ask ourselves, what's going on here? Is somebody deliberately changing the order in which they happen for some, deep, heavy reason or whatever? Or is he making a mistake? I mean, that's an option that we should at least keep in mind, that someone could be making an accidental mistake. If we're not going at this from a heavy theological point of view, I think it sometimes does happen in these 911 testimonies that people just remember things in the wrong order. That happens to me all the time, right? So there could be a mistake. Or is the author narrating achronologically? Is the author really not trying, and you just read it kind of hastily and you assumed he was trying to give a chronology, but he really wasn't? So we have to investigate all these different possibilities. I do not believe there is a single instance in the Gospels of what I call dyschronological narration. That is to say, I don't think there's a single place where they are deliberately changing how long something took, trying to make it look like it took less time than it really did, deliberately changing when something happened, like, oh, I'm going to make this happen before this other thing for some, made up reason. And every time you hear somebody say, so-and-so moved this, John moved the temple cleansing, or, or telescoping. That's another word you'll hear that's actually ambiguous. Luke telescopes the events after Jesus' resurrection. Okay, do you mean he's just achronologically kind of getting into a hurry there at the end of Luke 24 to where it kind of, you can't tell how much time is taken up? I believe around verse 44, he really gets his skates on, and he's just like, and this happened, and then after this, and then this happened, and then, I don't think he's intending to say that it all happened on one day. And that would be achronological telescoping. Or do you mean that he's deliberately trying to make it look like it all happened on Sunday, even though he knows it didn't? Okay. Scholar after scholar after scholar fails to be clear about that. You always have to ask what a scholar means, especially if he tells you, oh, it's okay, don't worry about it, something to do with the genre, something, chronology, ancient people, something, didn't care about chronology. And, we all just kind of, our eyes glaze over and we go, oh, okay, then something about ancient people, it's no problem. It's like, if it's just chronological narration, they're actually changing it. I'm here to tell you, no, there was nothing about being an ancient person that meant that, everybody just expected you, if you're writing in the gospel genre, to change the time when things happened. It's not a thing. Now, that's part of why the Mirror of the Mask is so thick. And that's part of why I said, I don't think I could call that an intermediate level, and why I said it contains so much boring stuff, because there's an entire literature out there that claims that because of the gospel genre and because they're ancient, then changing times was totally cool and you should just chill out about it too. And it's wrong. That's all wrong. And I explain why in that book. In fact, I'm just going to throw this in there, kind of an interesting little factoid. Saint Augustine wrote a harmony of the Gospels. And at a certain point, he explicitly says, if the gospel authors give a time, then they must be harmonized. I mean, Augustine's an inerrantist, so, he's looking at this theologically too. So, he's saying if they give a time, then they must be harmonized. But he says, if they do not give a time, then you don't have to worry if they narrate things in a different order. I'm not giving his exact words. I have the quote in the Mirror of the Mask. Okay, so what is he talking about there? Achronological narration, what I was just talking about. Okay, so Augustine clearly recognizes that there's achronological narration, but if they give a time, then he's like, no, then you have to take them seriously. And I have seen literally in two different books, one of them a commentary on John, the other the book Christobiography, both by Craig Keener. Dr. Keener takes that quotation from Augustine, he references it, he has a footnote to it, and he says something vague to the effect that in ancient times there wasn't as much concern about chronology, and in the context he's defending dyschronological narration. Keener is saying that something in the Gospels was narrated dyschronologically, like that John, in one case, moved the temple cleansing dyschronologically. And that's taking Augustine out of Augustine's own context. Like if you look up the context in Augustine, he's talking about achronology, not dyschronology. But, as learned as he is and a follower of Christ and everything, I'm not saying he's not, but Dr. Keener takes Augustine out of context there. And it's a rather serious error. To say that something about the gospel genre and being ancient, it was okay to do dyschronological narration. So that's a very long answer to your question, but I think it's the kind of thing that you were wondering about.
Yeah, he said thank you. And just to add on to that, Jesus was an itinerant preacher, so especially when you consider that he had like multiple audiences that he had to tell the same message to, he's probably going to repeat in various locations and various times the same message that could produce itself in the Gospels as seemingly the same pericope, but in fact are really two separate scenarios.
Yeah, and he did miracles of the same kind on multiple occasions. So, for example, the miracle of healing the royal official's son is not the same as the miracle healing the centurion's servant. There's no reason to think they're the same. They just bear some very general similarities. So often I really find that biblical scholars are very allergic to similar events happening more than once. And they act like this is just this terribly far-fetched thing, like, oh, of course Jesus didn't cleanse the temple twice. Well, it was kind of protest, and if they were still doing the things he was angry about 3 years later, why would he not have carried out that protest again? So that allergy to Jesus doing the same thing multiple times is really not, it's not supported by reason or common sense or even really scholarship. It's just prejudice in the discipline.
For sure. Did we have any other questions by anyone? No? All right, and then I guess the last question will be from me. So one of my interesting research areas that I've been wondering about, and I asked this to Dr. Benshaw, the TA of Dr. Gary Habermas, was the idea of incorporating genealogies into genres. And so I was wondering if you knew any material regarding because Jesus has genealogies in Matthew and Luke for the nativities. Are those best understood as a prologue to the historical reportage? Or should we try to actually defend Jews were trying to not intermarry with other tribes so that they could prove their lineage or whatever? What do you think?
I certainly don't think the genealogy is a problem with the genre of the Gospels, for sure. I guess I would see the relation to the genre as just being that the authors are trying to be truthful. They're not changing the people in Jesus' genealogy. So in that sense, you've still got that intention of truthfulness. What I think may have happened is that Luke may have received a genealogy that was actually of Mary, and it's just one theory, and that Matthew is giving the genealogy of Joseph, and that possibly Luke didn't know that it was Mary's genealogy. He doesn't say that it wasn't, okay? But he may not have actually had that explicitly made clear to him, and that's why he doesn't clarify. But I noticed too that the genealogy in Luke occurs at Jesus' baptism. So it's not a prologue. I mean, it's 3 chapters in, right? So you do have to see it as, in some sense, an integral part of the document. But I think they are definitely trying to be truthful. And yes, they are different genealogies, but I don't think that that's because they're changing the facts. So that's probably the best answer I can give you. I hope that's relevant to your question.
Yeah, for sure. That definitely helps, especially with like situating it properly in Luke. Looks like some of the guys left because we technically went overboard with time, but yeah, I'm pretty sure they would give you a round of applause.
Oh,
They were
no
so
problem.
good.
I already got a round of applause. All right. Thanks, you guys.
Yeah,
See
thank
you
you,
guys.
Dr. McGrew.
Thank you, Apollos.
You made it to the end of this video. If you enjoyed it, please consider becoming a Patreon member for Apollos Christian Apologetics. Your partnership helps with creating original Christian apologetics research, gets you exclusive access to videos, and more. Want to catch me personally online? Well, feel free to join our Discord server. But in any case, Christianity is true, apologetics is base. This is your boy Apollo signing out. Peace.